Welcome back, everyone, to the Disaster Tough podcast, where we share insights into the big plays and right calls of leadership. We dive deep into the stories, lessons learned, and ideas that will help you in the field. Let's go. Welcome back to the Disaster Tough podcast. I'm your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this week's episode. I have a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to talk to Amy Forsythe. She is a communications expert, so she's going to blow me out of the water. I'm very excited for that. In addition to all of her incredible experiences, she's all over LinkedIn, so you should be able to find her on there. She's also in the Navy Reserves. And on top of all of that, I found out that she was pretty heavily involved in trying to learn more about what happened in Santa Rosa, the wildfires that happened there in 2017. If you've been following this podcast, you know that I have been there. It was kind of a traumatic event for me. I've been to a lot of disasters in different ways, and yet I felt like a nuke had gone off there at Coffey Park. It was just white ash everywhere, and it was a new one for me. And so that put me on this train of different disaster types. How do you do this? How do you do that? And understanding cascading impacts and her perspectives and just understanding of that area alone. It was just mind-boggling to me. In 5 minutes, she rapid fire went through all the problem sets there and solutions. And on top of that, she's also a communications expert going all over the world, literally, to help out in real-time responses. And so with that, I just want to introduce Amy to the show. Thank you so much for joining me here.
Hi, thanks, John. Great to be with you.
Okay, so before Coffey Park, before Santa Rosa wildfires, for the sake of our audience, can you just help us understand why you're probably the most interesting person on the earth? I mean, you have such a cool background. Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit?
Well, thanks, John. I've just caught this epic wave of opportunities, deployments, exercises, and opportunities to serve. And so my career started, I joined the Marine Corps from Santa Rosa, California, my hometown, joined the Marine Corps in 1993 to become a combat correspondent. Basically, give me a camera and I'm going to go out and cover the stories and share the courage it takes to wear a uniform with the Marine Corps. Served active duty, and then in the reserves, I joined the reserves so I could finish college, and 9/11 happened. And sure enough, I got mobilized to serve in different capacities through the years. So I just had a front row seat to a lot of interesting events and opportunities to serve and been able to tell the story. I leveraged what I learned in the Marine Corps and became a reporter in my civilian capacity, covering stories in San Diego County, military news, and just a general assignments, breaking news reporter. And so I've kind of worn a lot of different hats in terms of the crisis communication and response, and found that a lot of people think they know crisis comms, but when they're tested and put in that situation, there's a lot that can be learned. And it's just a steady drumbeat of opportunities to learn and share lessons learned. So when people are facing a crisis, they can manage it and provide value to on-scene commanders. And that communications piece is so important.
I don't think people realize this if they're not really looking at it, but as soon as you start seeing it, you realize all the cascading impacts for good or for additional issues. That's the best way I can probably say it. When communications, especially those crisis communications, start to spiral. A very easy one for me to call out on the show, because I had an entire episode about it, was what happened in Hawaii during the wildfires. The crisis communication chain broke down internally and externally, causing massive amounts of issues for them that otherwise could have been avoided. From a person who has been literally in true crisis, and I want to get on the Marine Corps here a little bit because I have some fun news about that later, but from a person who has been in all types of situations, both civilian and in the military perspective, that crisis communications standpoint, what were some of the big highlights for you where it was moving the clock for you, if you will, on that learning curve? You have a couple moments that you're like, oh, that was a moment in time for me.
Well, I'll tell you back, one of my first experiences with crisis communication was my first duty station. That was in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in 1994. 1994, 1995, as you recall, some of your listeners may recall, when tens of thousands of Cubans and Haitians fled Cuba and Haiti to come to America, and they left in rafts. And small boats and dinghies and tires and anything that would float, they tried to come to America. And the Coast Guard and other vessels picked them up at sea, brought them to the small, tiny little Navy base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So I was stationed there working in radio and television for the Navy Broadcasting Service. And all of a sudden, our sleepy little training facility became home to tens of thousands of those trying to flee their country and immigrants. And so all of a sudden, we had to shift from normal operations to a 24/7 mission of communicating the story and what's going on, because there were riots, people were wreaking havoc on the bases. And so that was my first glimpse into managing humanitarian disaster. How do we feed the people? Where do they stay? What are they doing? We had congressional delegation coming. We had senior leaders. We had news media that wanted to come to the base. And so managing that with the battle rhythm, the operations, and what that meant. And so my first experience was that people weren't prepared for that. And so being at the front row seat of taking photos, interviewing people, documenting what was going on, and then how do we be of help? How do we not only do our job in communicating what was going on, but escorting media, making sure that the international world was aware of what was going on. And so from that point, that was a humanitarian mission. Then my next duty station at Camp Pendleton in 1995, we had an active shooter crisis where a Marine came in and shot and killed the commanding officer of one of his units. And so the base was on lockdown and responding to that active shooter back in the 90s, when this really wasn't
a thing,
especially on a military base. And so from there, I found myself at the forefront again of different environments, whether they were man-made or, some sort of natural disaster or fire or flood. On Camp Pendleton is where I was stationed here in the States for the most part of my military career. But navigating these different elements requires planning. And so as you can imagine, some of that planning isn't always done when you have such a high up tempo. You never have time to set forth a plan and a reaction and the interagency work that goes into the normal day-to-day before an event happens.
The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today.
CBRNE Convergence, the world's largest conference for the non-conventional threat, is heading back to Orlando between October 28th and 30th, 2024. With 3 days of workshops, lectures, and interactive sessions delivered by speakers from around the world on the latest issues and approaches to CBRNE and hazmat. Make sure to claim your early bird discount by registering now at cbrneworld.com/event/Orlando.
Can I just say, if you ever come up with a stage name, Amy Forefront would be a great stage name for you. Great podcast name. Yeah,
I love it.
My favorite show by far, this is going to date me and make me a dork immediately, is The West Wing. So you're now CJ Craig, head of communications. Jed, if anybody's wondering. It's funny that you bring up these two totally different types of scenarios. Humanitarian crisis, especially with the Cubans coming in. It was a, if I recall, it was like a multi-week thing, right? Like it was a long-term issue that you had to deal with. Versus an active shooter, it's very short-term. You immediately have to start having good reporting. When I look at reporting now, especially now with 24-hour news cycle and the requirement to be first, sometimes more important than to be right. How do you balance somebody who is in media to make sure that you have great reporting, but also be timely? How do you balance those two things?
Well, as a reporter, of course, it's breaking, it's happening, it's now, it's tweeting out. And so feeding that beast in terms of
Mm.
from a communications expert in a military or an agency or a organizational communications team has to understand the dynamics and the news cycle. There's no more cycle per se, but rather it's instant. And so
Oh, I
what
like
we've
that.
seen over the past weekend here in terms of the shooting incident that happened with former President Trump, we haven't seen much in terms of a presser or giving out information
Yeah.
to reassure people. And so it's a masterclass really in what needs to happen. We're all sitting around wondering, when's the presser? What are they saying? How are they delivering the information as a response? So everything needs to be instant, and knowing that, okay, the media are going to be at the front gate. We need to have somebody to front the information and prepare that person for the questions that are coming. And so being responsive, just being aware of the information cycle takes planning and preparation. I also was involved in the shooting incident that happened at the Washington Navy Yard in
So was I.
2013. Yeah.
Wow.
You can imagine how instantaneous, within minutes of hearing this, the national media right there were descended on the front gate
Yeah.
of what happened. I just happened to be there on temporary duty, and next thing you know, in a full-blown active shooter incident. And that really opened my eyes to how important and critical it is to plan with your emergency planning team and then prepare the senior leaders for a response mechanism that can't be hours and delayed by hours or a day. It has to be ready to go now if you want to be an effective communicator.
Okay, you said like 6 things. I want to see if I can harp. Let's see if I can. I'll try to go backwards rather than chronologically. I had Lieutenant General Jeff Buchanan on the podcast. Comes out the week right before yours, actually. And it is always surprising to me. And I don't know why, after 4 years of doing this, it's surprising to me. He was at disasters I was at. You just named incidents that I was at. Like, if we go through, like, it just shows how much of a beast this is. There's so many people involved in these different aspects and different roles. I don't have a communications background in terms of what you're talking about. I was more on the like after action planning side. And if you're looking at like all these different roles and responsibilities, I think Navy Yard is the one that we always call out in our training, because you had every state, every federal, every local, guys who were in private sector, guys, or guys and girls who were in fatigues, people coming off duty. You had all these different issues. And Kathy's was the police chief for Washington. There was at one point 88 different channels of communications used internally, let alone there's a hilarious is probably a bad way to say it, but Daily Show showed Wolf Blitzer on CNN constantly updating people on the number of shooters. There's a whole clip from that they show on the Daily Show of, like, it was every 2 minutes. It was 2 shooters, 6 shooters, 1 shooter, 5 shooters, constantly updating people. And it was just all over the place. And really what it turned out to be was different responders showing up on scene, and people didn't know each other. And so from an internal perspective, you have an issue, but an external issue, like, where's the show of authority? Where's the show of calmness? We're in control. That shooting in itself added a lot of complexities to that. The other thing that you called out towards the beginning of what you're talking about is the problem set of that planning piece, right? Prescott Nadeau is a PIO with the fire department. He's one of our podcasters with Life Fire Layout, and he coached me before I went on Fox or something, one of those. And he said, "Be brilliant, be brief, be gone." And so we worked on be brilliant, be brief, be gone. Like, what was my talking points? And we got on the media. And then the last part, sorry, I'm talking a lot, but it's hyper curious hearing your perspectives on these things. The assassination attempt on the former president. I pulled up CNN and I pulled up Fox. This was like within 10 minutes. And I actually found out through Instagram, which is fascinating. But on Fox, it said the former president has been shot. This was within like 5 minutes of the incident. CNN said Trump was injured at his rally. and it took CNN like 5 hours to say that there was an assassination attempt. Fox was very quick to say there was an assassination attempt, but their whole thing was about him being shot. They wanted to know that the president was injured. And both of those messaging, what they're trying to say to their constituents and what they're trying to get out, and also get people to click on it. Why, right? Because that's ultimately what they want. So it's just the beast is, is fascinating to understand the psychology of reporting. At the same time, how do you deal with communities? I'm talking forever here. I used to be the one talking. How do you deal with communities understanding crisis communications? Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Well, I do think that if you're a communications expert, you need to understand what the media is trying to do. Who owns the media is very important, and what media bias looks like, and agendas, and basically be able to communicate that to your teams and understanding that each media has agendas or the way they're going to report things. Doing media analysis, I've got all my channels up. I'm clicking around. I'm finding out who's reporting what and how, just to analyze the differences and understand. It gives you a broader picture. So when people, communications experts, aren't really having their pulse on who's reporting what and why, whether it's print, whether it's through social media or the traditional broadcasting, if they're not clicking around to understand who the players are, who's on the scene, who's talking, that's really where they need to be dialed into. Because if you're not like a true media diehard and understanding how these dynamics come into play when they're calling you for an interview, you won't know, I wouldn't say friendlies or what their agendas are, but if you understand how they've been reporting in the past, like their pattern of reporting, then you won't know how to prepare your principals or your spokespeople for the interview. And so any insight you can gain as to how certain reporters interview people or what they're going to ask and anticipate that, you won't be able to set your team up for success. And so for those reasons, it's so important that your comms team is dialed into all the different medias on the spectrum. And when I say on the spectrum, and that means their ideology and how they operate during a crisis, who they've got on their A team, their B team, and what it is that they're trying to achieve. Even with their graphics, not just the questions they're asking, but how are their graphics, where are they positioned in terms of how they're going to be reporting and on whom they're reporting.
Fascinating.
It's been fascinating. Yeah.
Just the graphics even. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if being dialed in and understanding the graphics from a communications team perspective so that you can prep people, are there incidents or commonalities where you just like want to put your hand on your forehead? You're like, oh my gosh, well, how'd you miss this? Like, what are the things from our side of the house that if we're going onto the media, doing those crisis communications, you're like, you absolutely have to nail X, Y, and Z? What are those things for you?
Well, sometimes you'll find me throwing my shoe at the TV or screaming at the television in terms of how people can really hit it out of the park, so they say, or be prepared, come to the podium with actual facts in terms of here's what happened, who did it, basically the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, why, how. But if you're not prepared to speak to these things, don't schedule a press conference. Don't come to the podium, as they say. Have your principals, have your people that can talk to certain aspects. Have your experts, your subject matter experts, ready to talk to that. For example, if you're not prepared, you don't come to the podium. Don't schedule pressers when you don't have anything to say, per se. But if you want to reveal and share those information pieces, you can. When things happen, a crisis occurs, you can put out a press statement, but be prepared to talk to that. And so that takes planning and preparation on an ongoing basis. Having your SMEs fully rehearsed in the course of, let's say, a 12-month calendar. How many times are you preparing for that? How many engagements are you doing that are not a crisis, but that will help set that person up for success for when a crisis does occur? So I can say for certainty that if you're not doing this with your senior leaders on a regular basis, when there is a crisis or an urgent matter, they will not be prepared to do that. And you will not have confidence that they can deliver at the podium when the time comes. And so it's not really a matter of if, but when your organization is going to have a crisis, or not a crisis, but an urgent matter that needs to be addressed. So fully rehearsing them with what they can expect is so important, because when the time comes, whether it's a fire, flood, earthquake, active shooter, get them familiar with the media and those beat reporters, and have that comfort and familiarity will go a long way in terms of a successful outcome for a media engagement event.
Have you ever had a leader where they were so confident in their own skill set, but you absolutely knew that they were going to bomb it? Did you ever just have to put a big smile on your face? You're like, you got it. Did you ever have to deal with that moment?
I've been so lucky because
good.
I've had some really great leaders who were willing to engage at the podium, and with just a little bit of coaching and a little bit of training, they did fine. And if they didn't do fine, we could, help with bringing in maybe a subject matter expert, maybe not the commander level, but someone who could speak to a specific point of technical expertise. And so having a team of people that I could trust, okay, we've got this person that can talk to this, or this person that can talk to that, or the fire chief knows the details of this specific thing. So not just putting the burden on one person's shoulder, but having a team of 5 people or so that we could choose from, a menu item. Here's on the menu, you can speak to this person, this person, this person, and gone through the training and preparation needed for each person. I've been very lucky. I would not put someone that I didn't feel comfortable with. It's not fair to them. It's not fair to the organization to put them at risk.
In the emergency management response for dynamic populations course, you'll master the art of managing large, diverse populations, like those at schools, hospitals, amusement parks, or stadiums. These scenarios demand rapid, adaptable responses where command and control, evacuation, mass care, medical transport and triage, public messaging, and counter-Sebring considerations are all put to the test. From October 22nd through 24th in Pueblo, Colorado, you'll dive into DIPOP training with the capstone Hot Mess Express exercise, taking on the role of an emergency manager as you lead your organization through chaos of a catastrophic train derailment. This high-intensity experience will push your skills to the limit as you work to protect and coordinate these ever-changing populations. Get ready to elevate your readiness in the most complex dynamic environments with DIPOP 2024. Class size is limited. Sign up today at thereadinesslab.com. It's a smart way to say that. You've had a couple themes already here. You've brought up teams a lot in different aspects. You brought up planning a lot. Crisis communications, obviously, is the general theme here. If you had a perfect scenario where you could build out your crisis communications team, what are the roles that would be involved in that?
There's several roles that would go into a really great team, but one of them obviously is a social media manager, someone who is so dialed in on not only what is the organization saying, but what are other people saying about your organization. So basically a listening post. Here's what the media is saying. Here's what other agencies are saying. Here's what we need to be saying. So filling in the gaps of misinformation. So someone in the social media role, someone who can work with the media, really knows reporters, has a pre-existing relationship with those reporters. And then, of course, someone who's a great planner, who is talking to your internal organization, key leaders, who's your key leader engagement, who's talking to the boss, talking to the commander, who has the trust and confidence of them. And then, some other folks that can write, take photos, manage the digital assets, someone who's really good with managing the imagery that's coming in, let's say, from the front line, so to speak, taking photos of a fire, feeding it back to the social media manager, and then who is going to deliver and create the content that's needed. So all of these things can be well rehearsed on your average, everyday, steady drumbeat items. And so then when a crisis does happen, everything is flowing the way it should, and it's all well rehearsed. But if you're not doing that in lockstep on a regular basis, that's when organizations can find themselves in trouble.
Okay, which I got to ask then, out of the roles that you just named, your least favorite and most favorite role within that?
Well, for me personally,
Mm-hmm.
see, I love social media, and I have my pulse on a lot of different social media outlets on social media. So I love that role because you're driving traffic or you're directing traffic. You're saying like, I'm reposting this. This is what this person is saying. But then I played the role of being the photographer. I'm the one at the front lines. I'm taking the photos, feeding it back to the rear area. Here's what I got. Here's the quote. Here's what you need. My role as a reporter, just being on the front lines. I love that. But I also love the media engagement team because I have a lot of friends that work in media. As a reporter, I love maintaining and sustaining those important relationships with individual reporters. So they're all my favorite. That's why it's hard to
That's
say.
why you're an expert. Yeah.
Yeah, hard to say. But then, advising the boss, coaching people in the media spectrum of how to engage with the media, how to shine when the pressure is on. And, there's a quote by Billie Jean King that pressure is a privilege. And so if senior leaders and those who are in charge or commanding organizations, if you realize that it is a privilege to be in those positions, whether a CEO, a commanding officer, or the spokesperson, that pressure is a privilege. And if you take that to heart and understand that you are going to be at the face of a crisis and preparing yourself, getting coaching ahead of time is so important because you have to deliver when the time comes.
I had a former guest on here, and out of respect for him, I won't say who it was because he didn't want to share it on the podcast, but he shared with me afterwards. He was talking about that same kind of level of privilege, and he read a book at West Point that talked all about if you're in leadership, you have the nicer hotel, you have the staff answering to you, you get all these extra perks, but you have to earn that. And he fast forward, and he was in, I think, Iraq. And he was in a firefight, and he had lost half of his soldiers. And he remembered that book. He remembered that you had to earn leadership. So he stood up and he walked over to each one of his people and said, "Get up." And he put his hand on their each of their shoulders. "Get up, get up, get up." And they got up and they got out. And he got awards for it. But it was obviously pretty intense for him. But I still remembered like the fact that like you have to earn leadership. It is a privilege. And if you do get those privileges, you better step up when it matters. Like it's disappointing when people have an opportunity to be great and they choose not to be great. At the same time, going back to that team perspective, I have a small company. The people who work for me are much better than me, and I love that. And it makes it more fun, but it also allows us to do things that doesn't just have to come from me, and it's much more helpful. And so your whole team dynamic. As we're moving into the last little segment here, I guess, for our show, you've talked about planning quite a bit, and you helped us understand the team dynamics in that and what you need for your crisis communications team. From a person who has been in everything from warfare through active shooters through humanitarian crisis. If you're talking to the emergency services community and they're dealing with crisis communications, what are like 3 or 4 things that you were like, hey, here's what you need to think about in your planning process?
Well, I definitely think being in lockstep with your operations departments, having them on speed dial, really and engaged in creating a training plan. What are we doing to exercise our own internal operations for crisis? I find that there's some silos or verticals that are not talking to each other, and only when a crisis occurs. And that's not the time to sort of meet each other. So if you have to be the first person in a communications, team, you be the one to go and engage with your operations, make sure they know who you are, and really work towards creating a training plan, whether it's a 6-month or a 12-month, 18-month plan. Get something on the calendar that says, let's practice this. Let's try this. Let's try an active shooter role playing event. How are we going to work together? Understanding the crises that are out there. What contingency do we plan for? Understanding that there are 1,000 things, pick 2 or 3 and work backwards from there, and make sure that the leadership of your organization knows that you're fully engaged and you want to bring people into the fold in terms of an organization. And where do people sit? Literally, where are our people? I think it's so important for communications leaders. If you want to be a leader in the communications of your organization, get up and walk around. Where are our people sitting? What are they saying about us? And how do I find them in a crisis? Where are people? Do they know how to reach me? Where do they know where I sit? Are they calling me on a regular basis? And so making yourself known. I've seen too many times where communications experts or team is hiding out somewhere. Nobody knows where they are, only in a time of crisis. And by then it's too late. So making sure that people are tracking and following your messaging. What are you saying? Is it reaching your audience? So kind of doing an internal audit to the organization. Do people know where we are physically? Do they know how to reach me on the phone? Or are they dialed in to our social media? Because now oftentimes people and organizations are using their social media channels to communicate emergency information. But if people aren't following you on a normal routine basis, they're not going to get the message when you're putting it out there. So are those channels a viable means of communicating? Are your algorithms the way they need to be? And so doing some rehearsals, some asking questions, making sure that your workforce or your teams are tracking what you're putting out.
I have a really curious question, a question that I get quite often, and you're the expert in the room, so I'd love to hear your insights on this, because you brought up social media there at the end. A lot of agencies struggle with getting out meaningful messaging, and they try to stay on brand and professional so much so that the everyday person couldn't care less, in all honesty, right? Like if they're trigger happy on the all caps messaging on text, or they get up on stage and they deliver their point, but it's not engaging at all. From a social media standpoint, there is a fear that if they put out something on social media that is either lighthearted or uses sarcasm or does different ways of communication outside the very formal branded messaging of their agency, that somehow it's not coming across. You fast forward to recruiting practices for fire stations. Now they're starting to use more of a TikTok approach where they're doing dances and they're doing fun videos and trying to get people recruiting to them by doing something fun, rather than the dramatic, I'm going to run into the burning building videos. How does a agency, somebody who's listening right now, who's like, we want to be on social media, we don't even know how to approach it in a way that's meaningful? How do you balance I want it to be entertaining enough to look at it, but I don't want to embarrass our group either? How do you overcome those fears?
There's been a lot of hard lessons learned over the past, 10 years or so in terms of what resonates, what are people willing to watch and listen from a very serious perspective of law enforcement, first responders, the military. It's a very serious business. So how do you not degrade or diminish the seriousness, or if you put out something funny or lighthearted, that it won't be taken seriously? And so, I think finding a good mix, because we're all just humans and we want to attract top talent. We want it to be taken seriously, but to what extent? And so finding the right balance, using I want to say crowdsourced, or there's a lot of funny, interesting, serious people out there who are good at it. So watch, listen, and learn. What's really hitting, and not just posting, but like read the comments. Are people appreciating that, or find it funny or engaging, to build the algorithms and then come in with the serious message? So there can be a balance, and it just kind of needs a more of a strategic approach when you're looking at, like, what are we trying to achieve? Who are we trying to attract? And is that message hitting home with the people that we want it to? I think it can be done. And there's a lot of great agencies out there that are doing a really good job of it, where it can be taken serious, but it also has a good, solid message that resonates with people.
Two cases, a couple of case studies in that. You just gave a master class on how to do that. And the examples that I immediately thought of was the National Park Service. They do these alerts all the time for what to do and what not to do in the parks, but they use a little bit of, humor, brevity in that, and they're able to do that. The other one I thought about was the first tweet, at whatever we're calling it now, from the CIA, where it was planned out, like DHS or it was the White House. I can't remember who was at the time. It was an official agency saying, "I hope the CIA isn't looking at this," and the CIA responded with, "No, we're not." And it was just like this, planned out but a little lighthearted, and it got a lot of attention, but you go all the way through. This is really dark and really messed up. Mike Tyson bit off an ear, obviously, when he was a boxer. Like, literally right after the assassination attempt, I saw a post that said, FBI conducts forensic evidence on the bullet that hit Trump's ear. And then it showed a picture of Mike Tyson on there. And it was just like, oh no. Like, people need to understand that there's a balance. Some things need to stay serious. Some things need to be lighthearted. I'm thinking if it's life-saving, life-sustaining, keep it serious. If it's preparedness, planning, the everyday stuff, I forget what agency did it. There's even a video, I think it was by FEMA, where the family was talking about all the ways that they're not preparing for a hurricane. And that got way, way more attraction than like the 72-hour kit that nobody cares about. So I think it's just understanding the balances there, the scope.
Sure. And, paying attention to what are other people putting out, and trying to, the comms team should be dialed in and listening, watching what other people are doing, and kind of being creative, being funny, being informative. So, in the military, our goal is to inform and educate and a little bit of entertain. So, of course, being informative and educating people, but also entertaining people in terms of, hey, do I want to be a part of that team? And so part of it is recruiting, and a part of it is working with HR in terms of who are we trying to attract? Because that is an ongoing implied mission. Always we're looking for top talent. It's a cycle that needs to be addressed at all times. So having the HR department dialed in also to the communications team in terms of, we are always recruiting. We're always on the lookout for possible employees. So we're looking at our future employment, our future ranks. We need to keep that in perspective as well.
You're like and I say this fairly often on the show, I love having experts come on here and do these mic drop moments. But I say that all the time for them, but you're actually the communications expert, so it really is a mic drop. But seriously, Amy, thank you so much for coming on, for talking to me. I know our field, every single after action report, I see communications on there. If I see one that doesn't have it, it will be like the second coming has happened or something. So the fact that you're on here and able to walk through, hey, this is how you do this right, means so much to me as somebody who loves communications. And I'm sure the field needs it a lot as well. So thank you again so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much. And, I love to connect on LinkedIn. If anyone's wanting to connect with me, it's always a privilege to grow the network so we can share and really trade information. And, I'm sure our paths will cross too. And we're out there communicating and working in the same space. So it's always a pleasure to connect and meet new people working in the same emergency and crisis response field.
Perfect. And honestly, you're such a great person to talk with. We would love to have you back on the show sometime, especially if there's another big incident. I would love to be able to hear your insights of the good, bad, and ugly and how that incident went. That might be a good example to walk through. For everybody who's listening through this episode, if you learned something, you got to give us that 5-star rating and subscribe. That's how we figure out if you liked it. If you have a question for Amy, obviously reach out to her on LinkedIn. That's how we found her, in full disclosure. We loved it, and we loved what she was posting. And so find her on LinkedIn. If you have maybe a more serious question, an internal question, you can reach out to us at contact@therunningthislab.com. We'd be happy to pass it along to Amy. And with that, we'll see you for the next one. Peace.